and those boards and commissions will be set by rules, either state rules or local rules. The mayor in the council manager form, and the mayor council form of government presides over meetings and has the power to call special meetings. By state law, the mayor is the chief administrative officer of the town, and to the mayor belongs the ability to appoint and remove employees. Those will be subject to personnel rules adopted by council. So I hope this makes sense. Council has the policy-making rule. The mayor carries those out in his capacity as the administrative officer. So the mayor will supervise the departments, act and vote as a member of council, make sure the laws are followed, and prepare the budget. Obviously in a council mayor form of government, you can what's called appoint an administrator to assist the mayor. So that's basically the structure of government. I think what's interesting and what for a lot of people who look at this, what's strange about city and town law is that it's not as well developed as state and federal law in terms of the rules of separation of powers. Here's an example. In the federal and state context, you can't spend money until it's appropriated. There's a separate act that's called appropriation. At the local level, there's not a separate act of appropriation, but you do that through the budget. And so what you have to do is when you look at that, I mean, you would say in a court case that you have appropriated the money by approving it in the budget, but it's not as formal. That's the reason I use that example. Does that make sense? Just the same as the separation of powers are not as formal. But the concepts, the organic constitutional concepts are the same. So what I wanted to do was go through basically what limitations exist on the council as municipal, our sources of duties for municipal elected officials. You probably know this because you both did it. There's a constitutional oath of office for all officers in South Carolina. It's kind of a generic oath of office. It's on your slide. Every public official in South Carolina takes that. Municipal elected officials have an additional statutory oath, which I have in your slides. I'm not aware of any cases where a violation of the oath was an alleged cause of action, but it is there. You know, it's the scope of your duties as an elected officials under the two oaths you take. A second source of obligation or duty is a state ethics act. We have a strange ethics act. It's a long, complicated document. A lot of it doesn't make any sense. I'm really only going to cover the basics of it, but it really what it covers is conflicts of interest, which all turn on an economic interest. Do you have a financial interest in the transaction? Self-dealing and influence, representing clients before the body, campaign practices, and then you have to file statements of economic interest under the act, which says every year you have to report a statement. Here's how I made my money. Here's what gifts I got. And those are due, I think, this week. I hope everyone's filed them. I think they're coming this week, yeah. Mm-hmm. But in most cases, the reason our Ethics Act is kind of weird is because it almost always turns on whether you have an economic interest. An economic interest in a transaction can arise directly. You're trying to get a contract awarded, or it can arise indirectly because you own property that would be affected by the decision. Once you have the economic interest definition in mind, it really, I think for most elected officials, it comes up in three ways. First way is self-dealing, which is basically you can't use your official position to get an economic interest for yourself. It's probably not necessary to give examples. It's kind of obvious. It would be comparable to the rules that apply to a director of a corporation. Influence, you can't use your official position to influence the outcome of a decision in which you have an economic interest. The influence rules play out. This is a recurring debate in South Carolina. What the Ethics Commission says is the influence means that if you have an economic interest, certainly you can't vote on it. That would be influencing it. But there's also case law and orders of the Ethics Commission that say influencing can be comments made during debate, comments made outside of debate, if you're trying to influence the government's decision. The question that comes up all the time, that I get it a dozen times a year, is the Ethics Commission historically has said that if you have a conflict of interest, you should recuse yourself, that's required by law, and you should leave the room. So let's say, for example, that a matter came to this council, you have an economic interest. Under state law, you say, I can't vote, I have to recuse myself, have to declare my interest in writing, deliver it to the proctor of the meeting, the city town clerk in this case. And then the question is, well, do you have to leave the room? And the Ethics Commission has historically advised in South Carolina, although not required by law, if you stay in the room, you might influence the decision. How? By making faces, you know, by frowning, by body language. So the question I always get is, do I have to leave the room? And the answer to that is legally no, you don't have to leave the room. But the Ethics Commission is looking for cases where a council member, an elected official, has either directly or indirectly used their position to gain an influence over a matter that they have an economic interest in. I bring this, so those are fairly straightforward. There's this complexity in the application, but they're fairly straightforward. My representation slide is not here. How did that happen? Ah, there it is. It's out of order. So there's an additional strange rule, representation, that a public official may not represent a person before any agency, unit, or subunit of that municipality for which you have supervisory authority. Just some context on this rule. When I was practicing law, I was at a law firm. We had a council member who was elected city council member in Columbia. Or so we had a partner who was an elected city council member in Columbia. And this rule was interpreted for a brief time to mean that the conflict was imputed. You know, the conflict of that council member was imputed to the entire law firm. So we had a 2-year period where our law firm could not appear in front of the city council or the planning commission or anything else. We were 150 lawyers. It was pretty damaging. They've clarified the rule now. That representation is not imputed. I mean, that makes sense what I'm saying, right? It's not imputed to people who are in practice or associated with the person. But the council member, him or herself, cannot represent a client or represent an interest in front of a body.
So where this becomes a little bit of an issue, I'm interested in your guidance, and spoken with the general counsel at the State Ethics Commission at one point in time, is this concept of imputation.
Right.
And she had sent me a case where there was a member of a school board who was also on a council.
Right.
And the school board was suing the town.
Right.
And the only economic interest was lawyers' fees, and that was imputed to the school board member.
Right.
So they could not actually act upon any matter the school board had before the town.
Right. Right.
Seems extraordinarily attenuated.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing I'd like y'all to take away from today is that our Ethics Commission, I have to be careful how I say this in public. Our Ethics Commission sometimes takes unexpected approaches. Their decisions are hard to research. Like if you've gone on the Ethics Commission website and looked for advisory opinions, they're not well organized. And I always advise people, when you get into questions of ethics, be very cautious in South Carolina, because I feel like it's very difficult to predict how they're going to rule on a certain issue. And I'll give you an example of that. I can't remember if I have a slide on this. On the representation, I may have a slide on this. If I do, I'll just gloss over it when we get to it. But I'll give you 2 examples of surprising results that the Ethics Commission has taken. One was in the context of the census being delayed. Because of COVID, the census was delayed. Every 10 years, you have to reapportion and redistrict under the Voting Rights Act and under the Equal Protection Clause. So y'all know about this. You know, every 10 years, you have to say, do we have the right number of people in each district? And are we responsive to the Voting Rights Act in terms of the demographics of our districts? Does Kiawah Island have separate wards? I should know that. Okay, so you're all elected at large. A lot of cities and towns in South Carolina have separate wards, so they would have to redistrict. Y'all follow me on that? And so because the census was delayed, we had a number of municipalities saying to us, we'd like to delay our election until after the census is released so that we can do the redistricting. It doesn't make sense to have the election in November when we're going to have the redistricting done in February. So under state law, you can set the date of your elections. State law says council sets the date of council elections. So there was a city in South Carolina that said, okay, we're going to delay our election by 5 months so that we'll have the census data and we can complete the redistricting and reapportionment process. And that seems perfectly fine, right? Permitted under state law. There was an attorney general opinion that I consulted with them on that said that's perfectly fine. They had the legal authority to do it. And the Ethics Commission said they couldn't do it. Can you imagine what their reasoning was? Their reasoning was because you have an economic interest in serving the additional 5 months on council, and therefore you were not allowed to vote on the decision to extend the term. So to use your term, Councilman Belt, it's extremely attenuated.
And so what was the economic interest in serving an additional 5 years since you're volunteering?
An additional 5, well, they get paid.
Oh, they get paid.
But they get paid a trivial amount.
Okay.
They get paid like $100 a month.
Okay.
And the Ethics Commission said you couldn't vote to do it. And I argued with the Ethics Commission, back channel. I said, that doesn't make any sense. This means you could never change the date of your election. And they said you couldn't even shorten it because you have an economic interest in that. I said, why could you not shorten it? And she said, well, because you might have an economic interest in voting against the shortening because it would cost you money to have a shortened term. A similar example is a case where a town council member appeared before a BZA. The town council member, so there was I can't remember the facts, it's a Surfside Beach case, y'all probably seen it because I've shared it with Joe. It's something that I worry about all the time. There was, let's just say it's a variance in front of the BZA. The applicant for the variance came to the BZA. A member of town council appeared in front of the BZA and said, hey, I'm here, I'm a member of council, I don't know this applicant, I have no interest in the matter, I'm not getting paid for this, but you should approve this variance because law requires you to approve it. And the Ethics Commission in an ethics order, an unpublished ethics order, so we have to share it with people so they know about it, fined that council member $2,500 for representing a client in front of the board. And that council member said, I had no relationship with this woman, I didn't even know her. I'd seen her in the grocery store, I would not have recognized her. And they said, doesn't matter, you appeared in front of this board and advocated for a position. So
Are those appealable?
they're appealable, yeah. But nobody ever does. I think you just, I mean, in certain extreme cases, they will, but. So I wanted to talk, so we're going through duties now, federal and state constitutions. Y'all know this. I like to emphasize the First Amendment these days just because, like, the constitutional restrictions, my slides are a little bit out of order here, but this one is the sources, federal and state constitutions. You know the general due process, equal protection, privileges and immunities. I like to mention to local governments the First Amendment because the First Amendment, I think, is the most frequently litigated constitutional provision these days. You saw it with signed ordinances. I don't know if y'all have gone through that, but there was, your signed ordinances cannot be content-based. In other words, you can't say there are these rules for temporary directional signs and these rules for sale signs. They have to be the same rules regardless of content. A dynamic which y'all may or may not have y'all had a First Amendment audit here? So First Amendment audits are where there is a constitutional right, according to the courts, to video record public officials in public places, so that in theory, a First Amendment auditor could walk in the front door of your administration buildings and walk around with their camera filming everybody doing their job. And if you tried to stop them, they would say you're violating my First Amendment. Surprisingly, the courts have been really protective of that right. And we worry a lot about what happens on social media. There's case law, including from the Fourth Circuit, that if you have a social media presence in which you conduct any official business, you announce to your constituents, here's a meeting, please weigh in on this issue, whatever, that you've created a First Amendment forum, which would prevent you from blocking a person or deleting comments. Seems a little extreme to me, but that's where we are with the First Amendment.
Doesn't it also require you to maintain a record
Yeah.
of all comments in case
Yeah, because
someone else deletes?
yeah, because they become public records. Yeah. So it'd be because the First Amendment says that's a public forum, they become public records.
And I'm sorry, why is this problematic? I'm not sure I understand your point.
I'm not sure it's problematic. I think it's a source of potential liability for elected officials that they may not have thought of.
If they don't do it.
Well, the way it came up, the case that we teach is out of Loudoun County, Virginia. There was a county commissioner in Loudoun County who had a personal Facebook account. It was her Facebook account before she was elected. Once she was elected, she started referring to her obligations as county council. They have a different title for it there. It's a county commissioner in Virginia. So she was a county commissioner, and she would say, we have a meeting coming up, please come and weigh in on it. If you have any questions or comments, please direct it to me. So she was posting things on her Facebook page that related to her business as a council member. A person came on her Facebook account and began to post comments that said, there are people on the school board who are stealing money, and everybody needs to know about it. So this county commissioner in Virginia said, one, I'm not the school board. Two, this is potentially defamatory. Three, I don't want this on my page because it has nothing to do with what I do. So she deleted those comments that related to the school board. They had no policy regulating that. And so they got sued, and the court concluded because you talked public business on your personal Facebook page, it became a First Amendment forum, and therefore you violated the First Amendment when you deleted those comments, because that was a regulation of speech. And so, you know, I'm not taking a policy position on that. Is that the right result? And you can probably solve that issue by having rules. You can say, these are the kind of comments that aren't allowed. You could treat it the same way you would treat comments at a public meeting. Does that make sense? So at a public meeting, you could say your comments have to be relevant. They have to be what's the word, non-harassment, no threats. You can have those same kind of rules as long as they're content neutral. But because she didn't realize it was a First Amendment forum, she hadn't taken those steps. And so I think the lesson for y'all is just to be aware of the First Amendment issues in your public communications. Many local governments, because the rules are a little vague in some cases, many local governments have adopted local codes of conduct or ethics. I don't think Keel Island has one. Do you have you have your procedural rules and you have your procedural rules, but like codes of conduct, attendance and conduct at meetings, interactions with staff. This is an example from when I was in private practice. We had a city where elected officials would host quasi-public events. Let's say it's a Veterans Day festival that wasn't officially a city event, but the elected official was involved with it. And they would make requests to the fire chief and sanitation, can you come clean up the event or provide security? And so we had to adopt a policy about when can an individual elected official make use of city facilities or city personnel in that context. Sometimes they talk about disclosure of confidential information, use of social media. I just wanted to emphasize that you can adopt local codes. For the Freedom of Information Act, obviously we have hour-long presentations on this. I'm going to go through very quickly. There's really two main components in the South Carolina Freedom of Information Act. One is public meetings. When are you having a meeting and what does having a meeting mean? And the second is disclosing public records. So if something is a public record. As I said, I'm going to go through this very quickly because we could spend a long time. One question we get a lot is what's a public record? What FOIA says basically is if a member of the public makes a request to you in writing of a public record, then unless an exemption applies, you have to turn it over. You have to make it available for inspection or copying or turn it over. So there's an interesting question about public records. What is a public record? Our act was written a long time ago, and it hasn't been revised to the modern age. So what it talks about is a public record is something that's in the possession of or under the control of the municipality. So how do you apply that to electronic records? And so clearly, I've got things that are definitely a public record. Anything that the municipality has in hard copy or electronic form would be a public record under this definition. If it's something that, like for example, an email on a city server, I think the city's in virtual possession of that because it's on a city server, right? So a text message on a phone provided by the public body, these are things that you could make the argument. These are electronic documents that are in the possession or control of the municipality. Where the hard questions come up is, well, what if I'm a council member and I conduct business on my Gmail account? But by the text of the act, that's not a public record, because it's not in the possession or control of the city. Every lawyer I know thinks that a court, when they finally address this issue in South Carolina, will say those are public records if you're conducting city or town business on those personal email accounts. The difficult part about it, and we have this issue all the time, is how do you get them? How does the city or town get them? So let's say Stephanie gets a Freedom of Information Act request, and there's individual emails that a council member or staff member sent on their personal email account or their personal telephone. How do you get them? You have to ask for them. You may have to get a court order to turn them over if they won't voluntarily provide them. But I feel pretty comfortable that any electronic communication that relates to city business, a court's going to find is a public record.
Could I ask a question? So
Yeah.
let's suppose that Russ sends me a text on my personal phone number to ask what happened at such and such a meeting, and I respond to him on what my interpretation of what went on.
Yeah, I think that would be a public record.
That would be a public record, even
think
though it's
so.
his personal phone and my personal phone.
Yeah. Now, and I got to be clear on this. We don't have case law on this, but it seems to me, having read all the FOIA decisions in South Carolina, that there is almost no question in my mind that a court would say you were conducting business of the municipality, and even though the municipality doesn't have that in their virtual possession, it's still a public record. I'm almost certain that's the way they'd interpret it.
So is there any court guidance, case law guidance as to what constitutes conducting town's business
Not a lot.
related to that? Because there are things that get very fuzzy or blurry.
Oh,
We've
yeah.
got Kika, we've got Toki, there's this IKEA forum, a lot of discussions about a lot of issues that touch upon
Right.
Toki issues, Kika issues, governance issues, development issues.
Right.
When is it just a private conversation about those issues between a couple people, and when is it the town business?
It's a great question, and I don't think we have clear guidance on it. I mean, there's language in the statute that's basically, I mean, if you were to boil it down, it would say anything that the council has discretionary interest in. Does that make sense? That if it's something that may come to the council, if it's something that the council may take action with respect to, then it would be conducting public business. You know, and I could imagine 100 examples. You know, let's say that I'm on a council, I'm an elected council member, and my homeowners association is doing something that I don't like. Can I communicate with another council member about that? Well, that's not, you know, homeowners association is not a government body, but that resolution of that issue could come before the body in a planning matter. So I don't know the answer to that. I wish we knew better. I mean, it's one of the interesting things about practicing in South Carolina is we just don't have very well-developed law on a lot of these issues. There hasn't historically been a lot of litigation on these. I mean, obviously, we're entering into a time where there's a lot more litigation, so maybe we'll get better clarity.
Okay, so let's make this a little bit more practical, because you're making statements of what is, you know, dangerous, but you're not really providing a way forward for us. So what I do understand from John's example, we should definitely not use our private phones for any communication among us, right? Would be something I understood. But so what I've done, for example, if a community member has contacted me with a question that relates to, you know, my role or what we are doing, et cetera, but it appears, or the entry comes to my private email address, because a lot of community members, for various reasons, also have my private email address. So I take this email, I forwarded it to my town account, and respond from there, without CCing my, you know, private address. But I basically take it, I convert it over to a public record, so to speak, because then I'm responding from my account of the town, okay, at kiowaisland.org. Is that, for example, a practice that you would think we should follow?
Yes. Yeah, so if we were giving
Although
practical-
there is no clear guidance from the courts, I mean, I understand that, but is that one of those practical recommendations you would give us?
Yes.
To say whenever something like that happen, you know, convert it over to your town's account and start responding and debating potentially back and forth.
Yeah, it's a great point. And so the practical advice we give, and again, I'm trying to adapt this presentation. Y'all are a unique council, as I've said. When we're just giving this to a general audience, we have very practical rules. And the practical rules are anything that in your mind relates to city or town business, conduct on a city device. You know, city or town device, through your professional email account and through your work-issued phone if you have one. And anything that's personal, including with other council members. You may be setting a tea time with a council member. You may be saying, let's meet for coffee. Then do that on your personal accounts. And the reason for that practical advice is because you don't want those two things to get conflated. You don't want a court to think you're doing government business on a personal account, because then that may allow access to other personal things. So our practical advice is keep them separate. Use different accounts. And so very quickly, sometimes you can't control that. Sometimes someone emails your personal account. And what do you do then? A perfect practice is migrate that over onto the official account. And that, I would completely endorse that approach.
So on this issue of commingling the two, if our town account and our personal account is managed by the same device, but there's separate accounts, is that sufficient, or should they
if they're
be
separate,
actually on two separate machines?
No, if they're separate accounts, I think that's fine. I mean, I think that, you know, I mean, this may not be, I mean, many of us are lawyers in the room. From a lawyer's perspective, I would ask, what would the discovery request look like? You know, in the discovery request, if you could restrict the discovery request to all emails to the account number that ends in the domain at kiowaisland.gov or whatever your domain is, then that is separate, even if it's on the same device. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Although I would envision a discovery request saying, or
Yeah.
any and all, you know, emails concerning town business
then
that
I
are
would-
on your personal account.
Yeah, that's right.
And then the question becomes,
Right.
are you already infected
Yeah, how do you do it?
by this attempted transfer? Is it sufficient to try to shift things over
Yeah, I
to
think
the
so.
public domain?
I think so.
But you have an additional argument. If you keep things separate like Michael has done, to say, this is my private phone, it's for private messages. My official business is conducted on my official email. So it's just a prophylactic measure.
So would you
May or may
recommend
not
that,
work.
No,
would you
and-
recommend that
I-
each of
I
us
get that.
has our personal telephone and a town telephone?
I mean, that's ideal. I mean, to follow up on what Joe's saying, that is the best practice. But we advise a number of cities and towns, some of our cities and towns don't have the resources to issue, they don't have enough money to issue iPhones to every council member and laptops to every council member. And so in terms of the legal question, is it fatal if you have the same accounts on, if you have multiple accounts on the same device? My answer to that is probably no. I think you could restrict the response to that. But if you have the resources and the sophistication, the safest thing is have separate devices. Just keep them completely separate. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So should we never, ever delete anything from the business or the Keel Island, Keel org account?
Okay, so the way that works is there's two separate acts. There's the Freedom of Information Act, which is 30-4, and there's the Public Records Act, which is 30-1. They use the same definition of public record, right? So if it's a public record under the Freedom of Information Act, it's a public record under the Public Records Act. And what the Public Records Act says is it is a misdemeanor to destroy a public record. And so you have this question, well, what's a public record? And it covers a lot. So the safe harbor is really what's issued by state archives. Have you all been, has this been told to you before? State archives have what are called, they publish recommended retention schedules. And we have resources on this. I'm probably not going to be able to tell you exactly what they are off the top of my head, but they have rules, for example, routine emails, I think the retention period's like 30 days. But there are things, for example, let's say I'm a citizen and I send an email that says, you know, I believe that you have a business official, a building official that is receiving kickbacks. If that was mailed into you in a hard document, the retention period would be, I think, 5 years, 7 years. So if it's an email, you basically use the same retention period that you would if it were a physical document. But they do have some, I mean, this is something we'll have to dig into, but we have retention schedules for electronic documents available.
But just to clarify, is that there's a difference between deleting an email from your account versus it still residing on the
Yeah,
server?
if the server has a backup of it. So what a lot of cities and towns that have the resources do is they do backups of their city, of their town accounts, so that you could delete it off your own device, but if a discovery request or FOIA request came, the city would still have access to it.
So, but I mean, if innocuous emails, which you don't want to have cluttered up, that are just like confirming a time to
Right.
meet or a time of a meeting or yes, and everybody says, you know, I'm available or I'm not available, you can delete those.
Right, that would be in the short retention period, yeah, so.
You would still need to retain, would the individual need to retain those on their email account? It would just be the town.
As long as the town, and I don't know what your IT is like, as long as the town has those backup records, then you're fine.
We do.
So I have to
Our
ask,
server, sometimes we get subpoenaed for certain things. I have the ability to go to our IT, and they can pull all the accounts or all the information needed. And then as council members leave, they don't run for reelection, other emails are stored and retained, and I have access to them with the code. So everyone's emails, including mine, are
Even if
retained.
we delete it from our phone, for example, it really remains.
Well, from the phone, yeah, if it's an email, yeah, text, no, but if it's an email, it retains, it's on our server. So it still retains, so if I
But
had,
not as it relates to text.
right.
that-
Text, we would, I guess, do a subpoena, we have to go through our phone company, and I don't know how long, like, for instance, Verizon or T-Mobile keep records, but it would have to be subpoenaed.
Yeah.
Getting into possession and control, I'm not sure we would be obligated to do that.
Okay,
Point is,
but again,
You can delete your,
right.
they're on the account. And to be clear, as Stephanie said, is how, I assume any municipality works. Your municipality has open access to all government email accounts.
Right.
And they have to, there's no FOIA requests. So I'm sure y'all are all cognizant.
All right, so again, a practical guidance could be, you know, prefer email over text.
For any, I would say for any formal communications, yes.
Okay.
I mean, you know, text is appropriate for the examples that Councilman Belt gave. When are we meeting? You know, what's the?
Yeah, but I
It's
mean,
kind of just routine
not
communications.
not an exchange over a topic that should be on the email to be on the safe side. So I have two more questions about this, because that's really, I think, an important learning. So we have two platforms in the community that are used often. One is a Facebook account for property owners, and the other one is a listserv called iKiowa. We are using individually, this for various reasons. Might it be, making announcements for, meetings that occur that are not necessarily visible to everybody, because we as a town have a limited number of subscribers for our newsletter that does not represent every property owner. Okay, so we have a limitation here. So often I would, for example, go out and announce that we have one of our, new community outreach meetings next week, Friday. So come if you wish, right? Just to make sure, because on these listservs, we can reach a lot larger part of the community than through our e-newsletters. Is that appropriate? Is that problematic? How do we handle, responses to such an, because I can only send that from my private account, right? So how should we handle this? Is this okay? Should we have a disclaimer on the bottom saying, if you want to respond, please respond to the kiowaisland.org email address? I mean, how should we handle that to make sure we are not crossing the line?
So in terms of providing the notice, I think that's fine. I mean, I think you can provide notice in any fashion that you want, and it's a platform that the town does not control, is what I understand. You're a user of the platform. I think that's fine. The issue is discussions amongst council members. I mean, that's the only, based on that hypothetical, that's the antenna that would be raised for me. And y'all, I don't know if Joe's told you this, but let me try to answer that question by telling you this. So a meeting under the Freedom of Information Act is the gathering of a quorum. If you gather a quorum this is the language that we talked about earlier, Councilman Belt, anything that the public body has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power over, that's when you're doing the public business. If the public body has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power over it. So if you gather a quorum of the public body to discuss anything that falls within that definition, then you're having a meeting, which means you have to post notice, et cetera, all the attachments apply. And so a question that always has come up in South Carolina is, what about discussions by email? And the Attorney General answered this question in 2019. What happened there was the commissioner of LLR said, hey, the members of my board will have discussions by email, reply all emails. What is the situation there? And the Attorney General said, we have no case law in South Carolina, but when we look nationally, states that have considered this issue, they say that discussion of city business, town business over email, even if it takes place over a matter of weeks, is a meeting. Effectively, what does that mean? I'm not sure. How would you give notice of that? How would you allow the public to have access to it? But in their view, that's clearly a meeting. So I think, responsive to your question, the problem becomes if you're posting to a Facebook page or a listserv, and you say something, and then another council member says something, or you have any discussion on there, and there's a quorum of the council that's somehow involved in that, member of the list.
No, I think that has never happened,
Yeah.
if I remember correctly. But
Probably
then,
not, but the issue is like we all probably on iKiowa. And,
well, John
all
is
but
not,
one.
I know,
But-
and John is also not.
But we probably would have
but
a
the three of
quorum
us,
just
yes.
because we're all members of iKiowa. So you do have to be careful about that, even if it's
But again,
innocent.
if you post something to inform the community, there's a meeting, there's an important topic coming up, that's not problematic.
I don't think that's a problem.
Okay, but then if somebody in the community responds to it, to that particular posting on iKiowa, either publicly or just to me, which then, again, in both cases would include my private email address, I would then, again, need to take that email, convert it over to my town's email address or account, and then respond from there.
Right. Again, we're at the outer limits. We don't have case law on this. We're at the outer limits. I mean, I want to give you an example of how this.
No, I'm just looking for your practical advice.
My practical advice would be make a judgment call. Does it relate to my duties as a council member of the town of Kiawah Island? And if it does, migrate it to the public.
Okay,
To the
good.
public.
But Michael, just one thing to note, you said you had to send it from your private email address. You don't have to. I added my town of Kiawah Island address to the listserv. So now,
Oh, you can do that?
yes, so now just anything I'm sending to iKiowa that is related to town business, I'm sending from the town's email address.
Good point.
The practical.
So you just send it to the administrator and
Yes,
ask
yes,
her
yeah,
to include that?
add your
Okay.
address. The more practical one that comes up, I don't know how you escape it, is we have these literally every day, is a member of the community sends a issue, question or concern.
Right.
And copies all of the town council members.
Right.
And maybe Stephanie responds or one of us responds. It may be substantive, said, I agree, we need to take, or it may just be, this is an issue that is worth taking a look at, but if you reply all, does that constitute the meeting?
There is a judgment call here. At what point is the council discussing amongst itself how to respond to that? And I can't give you clear guidance. I mean, I know, let me give you an example, like an easy example, because it doesn't strike anywhere close to home, but we were asking this question about what about deleting emails? I was literally having a conversation on Friday with a town administrator, small town. The former police chief just left, and when the police chief was leaving, he deleted 10 months of emails, the last 10 months of his emails. And the reason he did that was because we're almost certain he was engaged in corrupt behavior. Their IT system did not have backup of those emails. But clearly that's a violation. We know that's a violation, and that would be a crime. When we get into these more difficult questions about, are you having a meeting when a member of the public emails all the members of the council? They've started that conversation. Can a council member say, I think you've made a good point? And my answer to that is, I don't know. There's no case law on that. I feel like a lot of times in South Carolina, we have to say, use your judgment call and ask yourself, are we having a discussion amongst ourselves? The same thing you ask yourself in executive session. In executive session, right, you cannot commit the body to a course of action. So how do you draw the line between expressing an opinion and building a consensus? There's not clear guidance on this.
So let me take your example then. So a citizen sends it to all of us, and we feel compelled to respond principally to that citizen. Would it be then better just to respond, not reply all, but to reply to that citizen, so that it takes the whole group of council off of your response?
That is a prophylactic measure you could take to avoid the issue.
One of the things I think in some of these emails that do fly around, it's pretty quick to hit reply all, and then suddenly we're in a meeting. Maybe not, but so maybe what we need to do is be a little more intentional on to whom we are sending that response.
But that would seem to make sense, John. The practical issue is, are you aware of whether the issue is actually being addressed? I mean,
No, I get it.
Stephanie, all of a sudden she could respond, but what if she's not copying all of us on the response? We don't know that it's actually being responded to and what the substance of that response is.
And I would personally feel that, we would leave the wrong impression with the community member, right? If we would only respond individually. That, to me, has a strange taste, because he or she, for a good reason, addressed all of us. But my understanding so far was that, again, there's this email coming from a community member complaining about something, okay? And for whatever reason, he or she addresses to all 5 of us, right? And we respond, either Stephanie with all of us, or one of us responds, because it's maybe falling into their area of responsibility, so to speak. But it's not creating a discussion among us. It's just one way back, explaining something, not even suggesting anything, right? Except maybe saying, okay, I understand your point of argument or your complaint. Here is a little bit of additional, context, or here is what we can do about it, etc. And leave it as such. is that then already a meeting?
So
Or
I
not.
I would advise, here's what might help, because you'll find that the reason I'm being vague is because my sources of guidance are vague. If you read this AG opinion from February 2021, there's 3 examples that are given in that AG opinion. And the Attorney General ultimately ends up saying, you have to ask the question of the purpose of the discussion. So for example, one of the questions that Emily Farr asked, she's the LLR person, is, what if we're having a reply all email trying to set the time of a meeting? And he says, clearly that's okay. You know, and then she says, well, what if someone from the public emails into the body and then my body members have a discussion amongst themselves? He says, clearly that is a violation because that discussion should happen in public. But the vast majority of communications are going to fall somewhere between those 2 examples. They're going to fall somewhere between the clearly innocuous, we're simply setting a meeting time, and we're actually having a discussion on the merits amongst ourselves. And I, you know, if we were to boil this down, I mean, I would say, you know, when, if at all possible, avoid replying all to your council. That would be our, you know, my blanket advice to a less sophisticated town council would be, don't have discussions by email amongst the council unless it relates to a routine administrative matter. But that's obviously an overprotective rule, right? There's some times when a member of the public sends in, and I wish I could tell you better than use your judgment. I think the question you ask yourself is, would a court look at this and think that we are trying to evade conducting this business in public?
So apropos of that one, where there are clearly more things that are clearly a, kind of involve a substantive
Right.
issue. Is it too cute by half, which I've done, which is, you know, so it comes in, I'll reply to only one other council member, and then forward the reply I sent to one other council member, then one other council member, then one other council member.
So this is an open area of the law. And I'll tell you that I can give you more guidance on that one. There was a case out of Somerville called Croft, if y'all want to read it. And what happened in Somerville was, rather than doing, you're talking about, Councilman Belt, a virtual version of this, but this was the physical version of it. They had a developer who had an application before the board. They wanted the council to have discussions amongst itself. So what they did was, let's say it's a 7-member council. The developer came in, met with staff and 3 council members. Those 3 council members left. The next 3 council members came in. They had the same discussion. Those 3 council members left. Then the mayor came in and they had that discussion. So in none of those 3 meetings did you have a quorum of the council. In the Court of Appeals, in the Croft decision said, this doesn't look great, but it's not a technical violation of FOIA, so we're not going to find a Freedom of Information Act violation because there never was a quorum. In this same opinion that the AG talked about emails, which was after the Court of Appeals decision in Croft, the AG said, we disagree with the result in Croft. We think that's a bad reading. Doesn't matter what the AG thinks if the Court of Appeals says it's okay, right? Except for Act 3 is, that case went to the South Carolina Supreme Court on certiorari, and the South Carolina Supreme Court said 2 odd things. They said, 1, this case is now moot because the developer has said that he's not going to continue with the project. Ordinarily, that would not establish mootness because the developer could change his mind the next day. So that struck me as an unusual result. And the second thing the court said is, because the case is moot, we're vacating the Court of Appeals opinion. So that decision by the Court of Appeals is no longer good law. Everybody follow what I'm saying? So it seems to me that the South Carolina Supreme Court went out of its way to get rid of that law from the Court of Appeals without reversing it. And so all we have now is this AG opinion saying sequential meetings, even if they do not have a quorum, are going to be a violation of FOIA. And to put that in your terms, Councilman Belt, I think that doing that by email, a court would look at that, that's no different than doing it physically.
So, for me to understand, so a violation of FOIA means exactly what? So we have that debate among a quorum of council members on an email. Going back and forth about an opinion, you know, trying to figure out what could be a compromise, for example. So it clearly is a meeting, right? There is a quorum. Decisions are maybe not made, but at least prepared. So it would fulfill the requirements. What does that then mean practically? Do we have to take these emails and actively publish it to the community, so inform the community, or are we just, you know, at a point that if a community member would ask us, you know, what have been all the discussions about topic A, we would then need to disclose it. I mean, how,
Well,
what is,
okay, so those are two different questions. And let me say this, big picture, and Stephanie, and Mayor, I'll take your guidance on this. We have slides on this at the end. Do we want to delay that, or do we want to jump out of order? Now, so we're going to talk about the remedies at the end. So,
Let's do it at the end.
yeah,
Yeah, let's follow
but I
your-
do want to
your
say this,
structure.
your question about remedies, we're going to defer. Your question about, I want to be sure that we separate two things. One is, no matter what, those email discussions are public records, which means you have to disclose them if requested, at a minimum. Now, the other question is, have you had a meeting in creating those public records? And those are two different parts of the statute. And the remedy for the meeting question is the more interesting question, and that's what we're going to talk about at the end. An unnoticed meeting, yeah, what's the remedy for an unnoticed meeting? And we'll talk about that at the end.
Has the association tried to work with either, I don't know, would it be the state ethics office, or I don't know whom it might be, to try to get any further clarity around all this? Or could the MASC take a position? Because clearly, this is as murky as fluff mud.
Right.
And it's, you practically can't do business these days, given emails,
Right.
with,
Without
if
discussion.
with the strictest interpretation
Yeah.
of the FOIA Act.
Yeah.
You literally couldn't.
Yeah, I mean-
Just do business every day.
So there's no real mechanism to do that in South Carolina. I mean, we could prepare model guidelines that would potentially be persuasive in a court of law. We could talk to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General could write an opinion, but someone would have to request it. What used to happen a lot was people did test suits. So a test suit would be, you would find a plaintiff to sue the town, and you would finance the litigation, and you would get an advisory opinion. What was effectively an advisory opinion? That doesn't happen much anymore. The Ethics Commission is not helpful on these kind of things. There's just not really a regulatory body with authority to do this. So, but yeah, I think that, if we were to take official positions on this, which we do, but I don't know that we have a policy paper, that would probably be persuasive in a court. And certainly if issues came up, we would brief it from an amicus standpoint.
okay, but we will talk a little bit more in detail then about the remedies, but
Yes.
also
Yeah.
what exactly really constitutes a meeting if there is email conversation.
Well, I mean, I don't know that we're going to get any more clarity on what is a meeting under FOIA. Let's come back to that, because here's what I'll say about remedies for now. If you engage in a clear violation of FOIA, and you can imagine situations, I've seen this happen, where city council members town council members have an initiated discussion amongst themselves by reply all email, where they are clearly having a discussion that they would have otherwise had in open session. Say, hey, we've got this matter coming up at the next council meeting. I really want you to vote this way, and here's why. And then there's a discussion. If it's a very clear violation of FOIA, then the way the court would handle that is the remedy would be more extreme. Whereas if it's an innocuous, casual violation, like you said, I was trying to do the right thing. We were having a discussion. I didn't think that I was evading the open meeting requirement, but it was a gray area of the law. Then in that case, likely the remedy is simply an injunctive declaration. You did something wrong, don't do it again.
Possibly pay attorney.
Yeah, you'd pay attorney's fees. Yeah, yeah.
All right.
I want to
Very
talk
good,
very
thank
briefly, I know I'm well over my time already. The executive session rules,
Eric, I have a last question.
yeah,
So from my corporate background, I was used that emails would always go out with a disclaimer, almost automatically, right? Or we had to put it into our signature, that if certain things happen, for example, if you would receive this email by mistake, et cetera, I mean, stuff like that. I haven't seen it here in the town, which kind of surprised me, that there's nothing, disclaiming at the end in a way, for example, if you receive this in error, or please don't respond to my private email, please call me on my town's phone and respond to my town's email address, et cetera. Does that make sense? Have you seen this in other municipalities, that by standard, every email from every town employee actually would have that kind of disclaimer, or is it not?
I haven't seen that as standard practice.
good.
I mean, I don't think it's a bad idea, but I haven't seen that as a standard practice. Tyson, have you seen that in your clients? No. I mean, I don't think it'd be a bad practice, but I just haven't seen it.
Yeah, okay.
You certainly can't change FOIA requirements.
No, I was not going down that route. But just to, avoid that we make mistakes or people make mistakes, right? Unintentionally.
When we get into the discussion of the code of conduct, I think this overlaps into that area.
I would agree.
Verifying for the public, this is why we're doing that. It's not because we're being dismissive or.
Yeah, something like that. I would just, so I'm more asking not to avoid any legal remedies, but I mean, more to inform, the counterparts that you're communicating with, what the rules are. So, I don't know, maybe something to think about. Okay, thank you.
Well, on that point, we should probably emphasize something that I glossed over, which is in South Carolina in particular, the local code of conduct is a very useful device because we don't have really well-developed state law on these issues. And so a lot of times, if you say, well, we've had these recurrent issues, then it's helpful to have something locally that says, here are the rules, here's what we're going to do, whether it's with disclaimers, whether it's with forwarding emails. And Tyson and I have examples of local codes of conduct that cover everything from how do you handle emails to how do you, the last point I was going to make was what about the duty of confidentiality from executive session? And this is going to wrap up my portion of this. You know that under the Freedom of Information Act, you can go into executive session. And a question that comes up all the time in South Carolina is, well, what happens if we go into executive session and a member of the body or a staff member then reveals information that was discussed during executive session? And so one of the things that local codes of conduct address quite often in South Carolina is how do you handle that information that's presented in executive session? There's no law on this. That's the one thing I've said over and over again, right? We have a case that I cite here called Bellamy versus Brown that says that the public records part of FOIA does not create a duty of confidentiality. And if you read that casually, you'd think that means there is no duty of confidentiality under Freedom of Information Act at all. But what that case actually means is the exemptions to disclosure of public records don't create a duty of confidentiality. The executive session provisions are in a totally different part of the code. So a court could say that executive session creates a duty of confidentiality. No court has addressed that yet. I've seen some pretty egregious cases of council members receiving privileged information in executive session and then using it. The best example that I can give, and I know I'm over my time, but I like to just tell this is to illustrate how underdeveloped in some ways our law is. And this is all public knowledge, so I'm not telling anything secret. There was an elected official in a county in South Carolina. She was friends with the administrator. It's a county official. She was friends with the county administrator. The county council was terminating the county administrator. They went into executive session on negotiations on the termination agreement, the terms of the settlement. Does this make sense? How much are we going to pay him so he doesn't sue us? She was sitting in the executive session, listening to that and texting the county administrator what numbers it is. There was literally a text that said, you should hold out for $1 million because they'll give it. And the court in that case, and what happened is, they said, look, this is not a violation of the Ethics Act because she doesn't have an economic interest in this. It's the administrator who has the economic interest. And as far as we know, there's no duty of confidentiality in executive session. So unless there's some local disciplinary rule, she hasn't done anything wrong. And so, it's just this, now it never went to a reported decision, so I can't tell you that's the law of South Carolina, but that was the initial resolution at the Circuit Court and Ethics Commission level. I mean, justice was eventually served. She eventually got fired and indicted for misapplying, for basically falsifying county expense reports. So justice was eventually served, but in that case, that's a pretty egregious violation of the executive session, and we just don't know. But the way to address this is by a local code of conduct that talks about it. And we'll talk about remedies on that. One of the remedies, and this is my last slide before I give it to Tyson, a lot of what you learn either in public records or in executive session is protected by the attorney-client privilege. And so sometimes the case, for example, that I just gave you, the county, those discussions, the attorney was present and advising on the settlement terms. So that would have been protected by, those discussions would have been protected by the attorney-client privilege. But you know this, the attorney-client privilege can be waived. And we have a South Carolina case that I cite that says when someone waives the attorney-client privilege, for example, by publicly disclosing information that was heard in executive session, then it waives the attorney-client privilege not only on the matter disclosed, but as to all communications between the same attorney and the same client on the same subject. So it could have spillover effect. It could contaminate the privilege for that whole proceeding.
Case is that?
It's cited in here, Marshall versus Marshall. It's an old case, but the attorney-client privilege, for purposes of the Freedom of Information Act, would be read the same way it does for evidentiary privileges. And so that Marshall versus Marshall is an interpretation of the evidentiary privilege, but the law would be the same.
I think an important point that shouldn't be glossed over is the client can waive the privilege.
Yeah.
Not anyone else.
Yeah, and Tyson and I were talking about that this morning. It's a very interesting question to me, which is, in your background as corporate officials, you have this idea, if a lawyer is representing the corporation, then the lawyer represents the client, the entity, the corporation. And the control of the client is in the control group of that entity, the board of directors, maybe the CEO, maybe the COO, who has the authority to claim the privilege and waive the privilege. In most cases, the court would say only the board of directors, a majority of the board of directors has the right to waive the privilege. But you get into this interesting question, what if an official of the corporation voluntarily discloses the information without authorization? Would that A, waive the privilege? As Joe points out, only the client can waive the privilege, and that's not the client. And B, would the person who disclosed it have personal liability to the corporation? And this is, if you guys are, I hate to say again, we don't know the answer to this question, but we don't know the answer to that question in South Carolina. But it's something I would definitely think about, and I'd be very cautious. And most of the local codes of conduct that I've seen say basically no public discussion, no public disclosure of matters discussed in executive session, particularly if it's protected by the attorney-client privilege.
So two questions in that respect to actually both of you. So again, with my corporate experience background kind of thing. So we always had two rules. Okay, one, every time that we would start an email conversation with my corporate lawyer, for example, he or I would clearly put into the subject title, attorney-client privileged, okay? To make it clear to everybody who ever receives this email or sees this email that this is actually protected. I haven't seen that here, okay? And second rule was that we always, I segregate all my emails into different folders, when I not trash them, but I put them away from my inbox, so to speak. And I always had also an attorney-client privilege box where I would put in all the emails that are between me and my counsel, right? Or, between me, others, and the counsel. I haven't seen any advice in that respect here either. So how would you handle these two topics?
Well, I think the reason that let me say this. I don't think that doing what you did in your corporate background is legally necessary. I think the privilege exists irrespective of your disclaimer that it exists. I think the privilege would apply.
I fully understand it. It's more like, making people aware.
Yeah, I think
right?
that
Here we are talking about something that for whatever clear legal reason is privileged. So it's more to pay attention than anything else.
Well, it serves two purposes in the
you put
corporate
that on
context. One
emails
purpose
when
it
you send
serves is to warn.
Yeah.
It serves two purposes in the corporate context. One purpose is for the user's convenience, to be reminded this is an attorney-client privilege. The second purpose it serves is it's a huge litigation aid. When people are going through privilege logs in litigation, it's much easier to see this email has a privilege disclaimer on the top than it is to have to read it and make the individual determinations. And if you've reviewed outside counsel bills in your corporate background, you know that people reviewing privilege logs it's a huge expense, and if you can shorten it, it's helpful. I think the reason the practice hasn't become standard in the municipal context is just there's much less litigation generally, there's much less volume of information, and it hasn't become standard practice. I see no reason not to do it, but I would say, if you do it, it's not determinative. It doesn't, the absence of a disclaimer doesn't mean the privilege doesn't exist, and the existence of a disclaimer doesn't mean
it exists.
No,
Right.
I
So it's just, it's a prudential rule to do that.
it's just a, heads up kind of thing, right? Makes everybody follow certain rules, that's it.
yeah.
Okay, got it.
Sorry, I was a little disorganized and blasting through that. I was trying to, and even with going at that speed, we still went over time, but this is Tyson's
That's all
part now,
right.
so,
So very last question from my side. This is now public record, correct?
yeah.
So I should not throw this away, but file it away with today's session, right? Just for
Depends
my
on what's on it.
Technically,
education.
yes.
Yes, okay, good.
So
We can do a break before we,
Start with this after.
yeah. And then let's just, sounds like there's a lot of great discussion, so probably like a 20-minute, 20, 30-minute.
shoot
we'll
for
just kind-
12:15.
Okay, 1:15.
I mean,
Okay.
1, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry,
Great.
that clock's a little.